to continue to have these amazing conversations with these amazing people, I do need you all to subscribe. I've seen that the vast majority of you that listen to my podcast don't actually subscribe. So please do subscribe so I can continue to have these conversations that very few people are prepared to have. Subscribe now and enjoy the podcast. Amy, thank you for joining today. First off, where are you based and who are you?
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm Amy Hamm. I'm in New Westminster, British Columbia, Canada, sort of the woke epicenter of Canada, arguably.
All right. What is going on in Canada in terms of when we talk about women rights? So, in the UK, we've seen some changes in law, which has been welcomed by many people who listen to this podcast and people that we've had on here. What exactly is going on in Canada, and what has happened with you?
Sure. So I'm someone who talks a lot about free speech and women's sex-based rights. So Canada is a country where gender ideology has really taken hold of our institutions, our universities, our public policy. We've essentially got a country where self-identification is the law of the land. So anyone gets to say I identify as male, female, and they're treated as such in law. And this has been happening for many years in Canada after the passage of Bill C-16. And so a lot of women have been fighting against this, including myself, and are sort of severely punished for doing so.
Right. So, I mean, what in particular happened in your case? Lots of our listeners won't be aware, so it'd be interesting to find out. Maybe first of all, we can start talking about your career and then what exactly happened.
Sure, yeah. So I still am a registered nurse. I have a registered nurse license, even though I'm not working as one right at the moment. And I also have a background in journalism. So, um, for the past 5 years, I've been undergoing lawfare essentially for my views that I've expressed on sex and gender outside of work. And so activists decided that because I disagree with gender ideology and I think that humans can't change their sex, that I shouldn't be able to work as a nurse. I shouldn't have a nursing license. And they started complaining towards my regulator, the BC College of Nurses, and my former employer, Vancouver Coastal Health. And so this sort of all culminated. I'd been doing events and writing about this issue, speaking about it for many years. And then just over 5 years ago, a friend and I were involved with this billboard that said, I heart J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling being, someone else who she's not only a famous author, but she's now famous for standing up for women's rights. And so in support of her, we did this billboard. And then that really got a lot of attention from activists who started demanding that I be fired. And then in the 5 years after that, I've undergone a disciplinary hearing was more than 20 days, so longer, I like to say, than a lot of murder trials, being put on trial for making statements in my own time, in my private life, about, the binary nature of human sex. And after this process, which was dragged out over years and years between the investigation and the hearings, I waited just about a year to get a verdict. And ultimately, I was found guilty of unprofessional conduct for essentially for standing up for women's sex-based rights, for saying we deserve to have our own spaces free from males male bodies, and this includes sports, prisons, rape
Yeah.
shelters. So I said that, and I said, that people who identify as trans women are biological males. And for that, I was found guilty of unprofessional conduct, and then I had to sort of wait and see what my punishment would be. And so ultimately what happened is that a panel which included 2 registered nurses, 1 member of the public, and they had a constitutional lawyer that was assisting them, decided that an appropriate punishment for stating these facts in my off-duty time, never having a patient complaint in 13 years of nursing, would be a 1-month license suspension and to pay $94,000 in costs to the
Right.
college. So essentially paying for my own legal persecution. And then it's completely outrageous. So right now I'm appealing that penalty decision and the guilty finding of unprofessional conduct at the BC Supreme Court. No court date has been set yet, so I'm just kind of waiting for that as the clock drags on. Like I said, it's been more than 5 years now, so it's when people say the process is the punishment, this is a sort of thing they talk about. You express your political views, and if it goes against the orthodoxy of institutions and they decide to punish you, they have the money and they have the power to just do this to you for years and years and years on end. And who knows when the end will be there. And on my part, I wouldn't be able to even fight against this didn't if I didn't have the support of my legal team, which is generously funded by the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms.
Right. Why is it taking so long? Why has it taken 5 years for them to come to a decision?
Yeah, I mean, it seems intentional that it gets dragged out this long. The process starts, you get a letter saying that you're under investigation. The investigation takes months and months. And, then they at first tried to suggest that I reach what's called a consent agreement with them. So this was maybe around a year in, maybe a bit less. And they essentially said if I signed this quote unquote statement of facts, that and took a 2-week license suspension, that this would sort of all go away. But their statement of facts were not facts at all. It included having to admit that I was wrong and that I was transphobic, and I'm not. So of course, when you're put in a position where you basically have to publicly apologize and lie, and take this punishment so that you can make everything go away, what else are you supposed to do? So I wasn't willing to lie and do that. And then once you do that, it gets sent to this disciplinary body, and they decide, well, we're going to take you to a hearing. And and then it just they do a few days of a hearing at a time, a year later, a few more days, and it just keeps going on and on and on. And like I said, it's really, I think, the process is designed to be the punishment.
Yeah, it's crazy to think over a few tweets or whatever that it's taken 5 years for them to reach a conclusion. I mean, what's that like been for yourself, that those 5 years of going through this process? How have you been able to stay sane during this whole ordeal?
It's I have so much support, and I think that gender ideology, we see the way that things are changing around the world. You mentioned that you had, excuse me, Helen Joyce on to talk about the UK Supreme Court ruling, which said that women are essentially, they're biological females. That's it. So that's a huge development. And these sorts of things are happening. Other countries are starting to recognize that gender affirming care for youth is a medical scandal, and Canada is just behind. So while it's disheartening to sort of be going through this on a personal level, it's very great to see that this is coming to an end around the world. And I know that it will in Canada too. Sorry. And yeah, there's just so much support out there. And even the people who, don't stand up and sort of put their neck on the line, we know that most people hold these views because it's common sense. It's just these, people know who the men are and who the women are. um, so it's there's definitely not a lack of support out there, but that isn't to say that it's not difficult. And after this guilty decision came down, I ended up being fired from my employer of 13 years, Vancouver Coastal Health, who largely used the guilty verdict. They had sort of been, there was a dual sort of investigation, and I was being hauled in and out of HR for more than a year and under threat that if I said anything publicly about what they were doing, that I would be immediately fired. And of course, they ended up firing me anyways. So I've also done, and again with the support of the Justice Center, is I've filed two complaints at the BC Human Rights Tribunal. One is against the BC College of Nurses, that they're the ones that dragged me through this whole legal process very publicly. And the second one is against Vancouver Coastal Health, my former employer. And so both of these complaints are for discrimination on the basis of political belief. And in British Columbia, the province's human rights code actually includes political belief as a protected ground. Not every province in Canada does that. Thankfully, BC is one that does. So these cases will, they were, as far as I know, the first ones filed to sort of test out this women's gender critical beliefs as a political belief in BC. We've since then in BC have one other woman who has filed a complaint against her school board in British Columbia that has also filed a similar case, and it's because she was sort of discriminated against for opposing gender ideology in schools. So it's good that in BC we now have several cases that will be testing out gender critical views as political belief, and hopefully we can get some rulings that show that this is a valid political belief, and it's discriminatory to do this to the women who are merely trying to stand up for our sex-based rights.
Definitely. I mean, when you did these tweets at the time, were you getting a lot of criticism at the time? You mentioned there about how the majority would agree with your views, and I would 100% also agree with that. I think one thing that's sometimes frustrating, we had somebody on this podcast recently where we said this, where we think the majority of people definitely agree with what you're saying in terms of the gender ideology. What I believe in, I think everyone, majority of people, what's really frustrating is there's a lack of people. Maybe it's changing now, but over the last few years, that have been prepared to talk about it or just say the fact that a woman is a woman, a man is a man. I think there's been a real lack of courage, and I personally find it really frustrating from people who I know, very educated or whatever, who just are incapable of saying those words. I mean, going to your point is what do you think is stopping people um, coming out and fully supporting? Obviously, I can see that you've got lots of followers on X, and I've been able to find out your story from other people. But why is it that why do you not think that you have an even bigger support? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I do think about this a lot, and I tweeted this at one point where I said, I don't want to be used as an example of why you should shut your mouth. I want to win and be used as an example of why you should never sit down and shut your mouth in the face of this happening. So I understand that it's scary for people. And I've lost count of how many people tell me, I wish that I could speak up, but I have a job, I have a mortgage, I have this, I have that. And I have or had all of those things as well, and I lost my job and I lost my income. So, it's there are other ways that people who don't want to be as publicly involved in this fight can do things, like talking to their politicians, donating money to places like the Justice Center. Um, and that's really helpful and useful too, but it is certainly frustrating to know that if every single Canadian were to just stand up at the same time and say enough, that things would change. I found it really inspiring. I actually saw recently, there are a lot of videos coming out of Tehran right now, and there was one with people singing and dancing in the street, and women have just like en masse decided that they're no longer going to wear their hijabs. And that's it's so powerful when people do that. And I hope that, it's a very different situation, but I hope that we see something like that in Canada, where people just suddenly decide this is enough. We've had enough. We're done with woke nonsense, and we're not going to live like this anymore.
But what's really interesting is although the UK had the Supreme Court ruling in terms of biological women being women, it seems to have not completely died in the UK. So even recently, a few days ago, the English rugby team has asked to change. The English men's rugby team has asked to change instead of having man of the match, so the best player on the pitch. They want it to change to just player of the match, and there's lots of examples of stuff like that still existing in the UK where people are pushing back, and despite there being written in law what had happened, there is still some pushback, which is still concerning, and there are question marks whether the Labour government will actually either punish or really make sure the law is actually acted, for example, at schools, in police, and all this sort of stuff. I just find it really surprising and almost shocking what's going on in Canada still. I mean, what does the average Canadian think on this subject matter? Are they inclined on the same side as yourself, or are they more on the other side?
There have been polls in Canada, and we know that this is, believing that there are only two sexes and knowing people can't change their sex is it's a majority view. So this the people who are suggesting that it's akin to hate speech or literally hate speech to say otherwise, they are a minority of very loud activists, but they are the people that have managed to take control of most Canadian public institutions, including regulatory bodies, colleges like the College of Nurses and Midwives. It's also physician colleges. I know a lot of doctors that have also run into problems with their regulators for speaking out, whether it's about gender or whether it was about COVID lockdowns. So it's really an issue. And like you said, in the UK, despite this landmark court ruling, you still have to contend with the fact that all of these charities, institutions are still run by these people that hold these extreme beliefs. And you still have to make sure that the policies get changed and that they're following the laws. And I think in Canada, the same thing will happen, say, if we vote in a conservative government at some point, and we know that the Conservative Party here has been more vocal about not supporting this ideology. It's still going to be an uphill battle and a fight to remove this stuff from our institutions. And I don't know how long that will take, but I think it's certainly a lesson from the UK that even once you sort of restore sanity, either via an election or via a court ruling on this is reality, there's still is going to require a lot of time and effort to sort of bring the culture back to sanity and out of the grips of these crazy woke ideologues.
Definitely, and I mean, you mentioned the Conservatives in Canada. So previously, the UK has a Labour government. Prior to that, it was a Conservative government. And what's almost a bit scary and alarming, a lot of this stuff that was allowed to happen did happen under a Conservative government. There was a lack of accountability on the fact that men were going into women's spaces, and you'd have hoped a Conservative government would have maybe done something about it. They have changed their tune since, but it just goes to show how crazy this ideology did become at one point, where even so-called conservative leaders were failing to really act and do anything, especially in the UK. I mean, going back to yourself, I was reading it was what they had said was the tweets between I think 2018 and 2021. I mean, I can remember that period being pretty crazy period in particular on Twitter at the time. I remember even just posting something where somebody had sent me all these different flags and had asked me which flag do I agree with, which one I don't, and I just said only the United Kingdom because I was born in the United Kingdom, and maybe India because my parents were born there. And I remember the level of people saying you're being transphobic, you didn't include the pride flag and all this sort of stuff, and that was very innocuous. I didn't say anything, and that's when I realized that this is actually a lot crazier than I thought. I mean, with yourself, when you were doing these tweets at that time, were you getting as much support as you get now, or was it just overtly negative?
Definitely not. It's changed so much in recent years. When I first started talking about this, I think a lot of people, first of all, didn't really know what was going on, so they didn't know how to respond, or they would uh, respond by sort of trying to give you a lecture about your privilege, or, well, you're a cisgendered white woman and you shouldn't be saying this. You need to listen to the lived experience of yada yada. But the support has grown over the years for sure, and this has become an issue. The gender ideology, when I first was interested in it, this was at a time when you were seeing more about it in kind of like niche online communities. And I was starting to notice that the vocabulary and these ideas were starting to spill out into mainstream culture. And this was around the time I was noticing how bizarre it was. This was around the same time that Canada was passing Bill C-16, which enshrined gender identity into the criminal code and human rights legislation here. So this was all sort of happening, and it wasn't, most people weren't aware of what was going on. It wasn't on their radar. And when you started talking about it, the initial response, I think a lot of people were shocked and thought maybe you're being hateful or something. But now that it's been so mainstream, it's absolutely everywhere. Like the Progress Pride flag is plastered all over our school. There
Wow.
are so many people identifying as trans and non-binary. It's just become such a massive part of our culture that everybody knows now. And I think the definitely the amount of support that you get, and the amount of people who are just frankly sick of hearing about it all the time and sick of how much it's forced down our throats everywhere we go, has grown immensely.
Is when you say it's everywhere, the pride flags and stuff like that, is that in mainly in big cities in Canada? Because for example in the UK that is definitely, if you go to London, it is plastered absolutely everywhere in London. But I sometimes feel in the more suburbs or other areas of the UK you don't really see that. Although actually that's not completely true because I've seen it now actually weirdly enough happen in suburbs. But generally speaking, it seems to be more big cities in the UK. Is that similar in Canada, or is it just everywhere in Canada?
It seems to be everywhere. And actually, last night there was this event for one of the local papers that I write for, and this woman came out from the suburbs. So she's from about an hour and a half outside of Vancouver, and she was saying she feels isolated because she doesn't have a lot of people who she can talk to about her political views because she's not woke. And I actually asked her that. I said, we have this impression that once you sort of get out to the area that you're in, that a lot less people are into it. But she said no, it's actually pretty universal. So unfortunately not. And then, like I said, when you have the institutions that are captured, all of the all of the school boards, even in rural areas, are buying into this. So all the kids are exposed to it everywhere. It really doesn't seem to be isolated to small cities. And I was earlier this year. I actually traveled to Alaska, and so I went to a lot of these small cities in Alaska, and I was shocked. Even America, not Canada, but I was still shocked. Everywhere I went, every second window of every business had a Progress Pride flag. And I would have thought, like in Alaska, that's wild. You think of it as like this wild frontier full of like tough bushmen. And yet I go there and I'm like, this looks just like Vancouver with these flags everywhere. You can't escape it.
That's so scary. I mean, that is deeply, deeply concerning. I mean, I want to get on to your point with regards to school curriculum because that's something that did happen also in the UK and is still happening in the UK, which is again crazy, crazy. Kids being taught there's 99 different genders and all this sort of stuff, which is really concerning in the UK. From what I was reading before our conversation now, that it looks like it's even worse in Canada in terms of school curriculum. It'd be great if you could shed some light in terms of what the average child is taught at school when it comes to gender.
Yeah. So British Columbia, the province that I'm in, they're really huge on this stuff, as I've mentioned. And what the curriculum is called here is SOGI, or sexual orientation gender identity. And it started in kindergarten. So you can look at all of this stuff online. And some people, so part of it depends on the teacher that you get. The thing about Soji is it's not necessarily mandatory that all of these lessons are being taught. So if you end up with a woke teacher, definitely you should be concerned, because when you look at what's in the curriculum, it's insane. You know, pronoun lessons starting in kindergarten, and books about how, you know, this red crayon feels like a blue crayon, and
Right.
switching back and forth. So it's really extreme. There was another lesson, I think it was for grade 3 or 4 kids, about a girl that likes hockey, and oh, it's probably a boy, and a boy that likes girls' toys, so it's actually a girl. Just extremely sexist, regressive lessons. And my advice for Canadian parents is, so many people are already homeschooling or using private schools, even private religious schools. If atheist secular families will rather put their kids into a private Catholic school than public school, because they know how much this stuff is pushed in public schools. And so that was a huge concern for me too. I have two young boys who are in public school, and I can't, like, as a single mom, I have to work. I can't homeschool them. But so what I would say is that, like I mentioned, this curriculum is not mandatory. The teachers don't have to do it. So what you really need to do is you have to know your child's teacher, and you have to talk to your kids and figure out what they're being taught. And I know for my kids, I've really been firm about, if you're being told, if your teacher talks to you about pronouns, or talks to you about picking your gender, changing your gender, saying that someone's switched from boy to girl, you have to let me know. Because some adults have these ideas, and they're not true. And I need to talk to your teacher if you're starting to hear this stuff. And so far, it has been okay. I've had one iffy teacher last year, but I'm sort of I'm you just have to stay involved, and you have to make sure you know what's going on in your kids' lives. And it's really tough. I feel terrible that I don't have the capability to just put my kids in a private school or to homeschool them. But you can, I think, manage putting your kids in public school. You just have to make sure that you stay on top of what's going on.
Could you pull them out if they get taught those classes? Could you, I don't know, write in and pull them out? The reason I ask is because I know in the UK, not on this subject matter, but I remember even going back to school, even primary school, a long time ago. Like, I didn't go to a religious school, but the norm back then was to do like morning prayers, like normal Christian kind of prayers. And my parents, even though I'm not Christian, they had no problem with me sitting in and singing along. But I do remember some religious people, kids being pulled out the class in the mornings, and they'll just wait outside and wait till it's finished or whatever, like morning assemblies. That's it, and we'll do that. Is that an option for, let's say, your children, where you say to the school, under no circumstances I want them to be taught this. If it's taught, they can just go in a different room and play or whatever. Is that an option?
I think it varies by your province, and I know So, for instance, Alberta, which is the neighboring province to BC, they've at one point tried to do something where parents could opt out of this education. But another issue with SOGI is that they tie it in with sex education in general, or they just tie it into the curriculum. So they might do part of SOGI teaching math. So they try to put its tendrils in everywhere, and it's not that you can just exclude your child from a half hour lesson that happens once a week or something. They're actually doing it throughout the week. So it's really sort of pernicious in that way. And so yeah, like I haven't really heard from parents who are trying to do that. But I know for myself, I think, like I said, it's just a matter of watching for warning signs and um, or talking to the school about not wanting your kids to be exposed to that. But that also carries some risk. As I mentioned, there's this BC woman who has filed this human rights complaint because of what the school district has done to her. And in her case, she was excluded from this homestay program. So in a previous year, she had an international student living in her home and it went well. And then she was suddenly dropped from the program a year later. She did a freedom of information request to see what was going on, and she got emails from school administrators saying that because of her gender critical political views, they were going to not allow her to have homestay children. And then earlier in this school year, they actually threatened her with police and banned her from her son's school grounds because she had shared a photo of a teacher at the school on Facebook. So this was a teacher at work wearing a Progress Pride flag on their shirt. And she posted, it was a blurry photo. It didn't identify the teacher. It just said, here's a teacher on the job promoting this political ideology. And the school sent her a letter that said, you have to take that post down. You're inciting violence. And she refused to do it. And then they banned her from the school ground. So it's, it's really scary knowing that it feels like the schools think that they should have control over what your children think and learn.
Web results. I can show them if you
Sorry,
ask again
Siri.
from your iPhone.
I don't know if
Okay.
that recorded. Siri just talked in the background. But
No, that's so
it's
true. It's so true. It's the same in the UK, and like it's a really big debate. Well, maybe I think it should be a bigger debate is the role of teachers in the UK, and I feel like they really are overstepping the lines of what a teacher does in terms of what their job is, and a lot of the time it feels like they are taking the role of parent in a lot of situations, and the gender one is a really, really crazy one where I know it's changing, but at some points in the UK it was, pupils weren't supposed to talk to children weren't supposed to talk to their parents about their gender views, but their teachers first and stuff like this, which is or parents could be left out that conversation, even if it's a small child, and it just feels like, and this isn't to all teachers, but it does feel like certain teachers do come in with a political ideology that they try to enforce on children, on impressionable young children, which I think is really, really wrong. And I don't know how it is in Canada, but in the UK there is a serious issue where there is like 90% of teachers, if not more, do belong to the left, and um, probably don't. You'd think it shouldn't really be an issue when you're just teaching factual stuff, but when it comes to stuff like this, I think that's when there starts to be a serious, serious problem. And the idea that a teacher is pushing this sort of stuff on is so scary.
It is scary. The thought of a teacher socially transitioning a child behind the parent's back is horrifying. Just the notion of keeping secrets from parents and your child keeping secrets with another adult is such a red flag for child
Yeah.
safeguarding in and of itself. And then there's the other aspect of it is that when you socially transition a child, it's quite likely that they will end up becoming medically transitioned as a result. And of course, people can say, well, it's just a social transition. It's not like they got hormones or whatever, but you're leading them on a path to do that. And it's very, it's frightening.
I want to go back on the point you mentioned about the girls being want to be hockey players and boys them saying that if you're a girl wants to be in hockey or some sort of sport that you should maybe be a boy and stuff like that. It's really interesting because we had Miriam Grossman, the first person we had on this podcast was her, and she's written a whole book and this sort of stuff, and I found it fascinating about how she was almost talking to young parents on the podcast as it was kind of directed towards, and she was saying how crazy it is now where you have to tell your children that you are a boy. It's okay to like pink, you're still a boy. It's okay, even if you know you can wear a girl's clothes or whatever, you are still a boy. You're always going to be a boy. You can like be more feminine. Same for girls, you can want to play football. You can want to do this stuff. You're still, and it was really interesting hearing her speak like this because it's something that I'm sure you and me, when we were growing up, we never had this to think like that. Our parents would never have to think of these kind of conversations. But it's really interesting now that this new the new generation of parents obviously have to think about these things. I mean, how frustrating is that for you when it's one of those things that's already got lots on your mind as it is, and then you've got to think about this stuff that's being taught at school? How frustrating is it for you? And is there any sort of change that's going on in Canada that makes you feel more confident that this is just, if you like, a phase?
Um, it's very frustrating, and I do that with my kids too. I've had so many conversations about you. It's funny because people think that gender critical persons are the regressive, sexist ones, and yet we're the ones who are sitting here and saying you can be a boy, you can play with dolls, you can like pink, you're still a boy. And the inverse is actually what's the sexist and regressive thing, is to say that because you're a boy and you don't like traditional boy things, then you're not a boy. So I do say that to my kids all the time. And yeah, it's interesting. There was a recent, so this was US data, not Canadian data, but a new Eric Kaufman, he's a professor, and so he compiled this data from a lot of surveys, and it was American youth, first year university, I believe, maybe end of high school, first year university, somewhere around that. And he found that the number of youth that are identifying in the sort of queer non-binary category is dropping quite quickly, which it aligns with this notion that a lot of gender critical people have put forward, saying that this is a social contagion that was driven by social media. And it appears, at least in the US, to be on a downward trend. And we don't really know if the same trend is happening in Canada. I suspect that it might be. And it's next. So we do in Canada, we have the last one was in 2021 and the next one is 2026. So every 5 years we do the census. And the last one that they did here, this was the first census in Canada where they started asking people about trans identity, non-binary, all this sort of stuff. And so once this happens next May and once the data comes out, then Canadians will actually have some sort of an idea about if this is going up or if it's going down. And it's all stratified by age too. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that. And I sort of do suspect that, like in the US, this is something that sort of peaked and is going to start going down. And maybe partly because once it became so institutionalized and all of these adults are pushing it, as we all know, when you're a teenager, the most uncool thing that you possibly would want to do would be what all of the adults around you are sort of pushing, right? So we'll see, but I'm really hoping. It seems like there's been a big shift in online culture, and you hear a lot about youth starting to push back on this stuff and to think that it's silly. So my fingers are crossed, but I don't think we'll know in Canada until after our next census comes out what's actually going on.
I agree with you. I think it feels like is on a more of a downward trajectory, and on a daily basis, I always keep thinking that it's getting better and better. The only thing that ever really changes me a little bit is when I see on like Netflix and stuff like that, where it is just crazy the amount of stuff that's going on. I'm watching a series now, Wayward or something, and it is just crazy. It's a good show, but there's I don't know how to describe the person. They're in a lesbian relationship, but the woman is changing to a man. It's just like that. That's just one couple, and it's absurd the amount of numbers on just this one show, and stuff like that worries me. And then I remember seeing stuff on Disney about I think it was like Transformers was for like kids, and it was the robot was explaining about how don't call him a he or a she, it's a they or them, and it's like cartoon version for kids, and it's just like wow, this is I think that stuff is the stuff that I think worries me at the moment. What I'm seeing online in general definitely is on the trend of downward trajectory, and I do think um, your kids in 10, 20 years time, whatever, will be sitting there thinking like, how did you guys let this happen? Like, how is this even a thing that you questioned what a boy is and what a girl is? I think they'll look at this and just think it's absolutely crazy that we went through this period. But I do worry about some people doubling down. I don't know, again, Canada and your experience, but I feel like since the court ruling in the UK, there's some people who have quietly accepted it. But there's some people who have now doubled down on it, which really, really worrying. Again, it's difficult to tell in terms of Canada, but are there people doubling down? Are there big figures in the political scene or just cultural scene in Canada that are just really pushing the trans agenda still?
Yeah, people definitely are doubling down. It's wild to see. I can understand when people double down if you're a parent that has medically transitioned your child, and it would be very difficult for you to come to terms with the fact that you participated in harming your child in that way, because
Yeah.
that's ultimately what you've harmed your child. And part of me is so frustrated by those people doubling down, but I get it, because how painful an admission would that be? And I think they might spend the rest of their lives in denial. But the other people doubling down in Canada are medical professionals. We have the so we're full steam ahead in terms of offering these services. We're expanding these services even. And the clinics that are doing it have taken things like the CAS review that came out of the UK. And there was sort of an equivalent report that came out in America earlier this year, just showing that not only is there not good evidence to suggests that pediatric gender affirming care is helpful. It may even be harmful. And it's being ignored. The physicians in Canada are saying that the CAS review, etc., is politically biased, rather than accepting the truth that no, what's politically biased was all of the WPATH guidelines that you're using to push
Yeah.
this care. Um, and it's hard to it's really hard to understand how so many people in the medical profession have really just thrown out the most basic principle of their profession. In you're there to help people, not to harm them. And it's unfathomable, and it's so infuriating, and the madness just continues in Canada. And
I can't imagine what it must feel like for you being a medical professional. We say so much on this podcast that people I think that we just can't understand are the doctors, the people recommending this. These are people who've sworn an oath, and these are people who know the human body and better than anyone else. And they're the ones in the UK that did some awful things. US, Canada, clearly, and I just can't understand how any of them can partake in any of this. It's mind blowing. I can't wrap my head around what makes them possess the thinking to go ahead and do this. And we have obviously the NHS in England, the National Health Service, which is paid by British taxpayers, and there are examples of people who have been able to do this gender affirming care via the NHS, even though the NHS is we regularly heard it's underfunded. You have people having to postpone leg surgeries, all this sort of stuff because there's not enough people, but they have enough resources to change children's body parts, and it's absolutely crazy, and it really is sickening. I mean, your example in terms of what the Canadian healthcare is doing is uh, it's absolutely crazy. Are there other nurses, and maybe it's a question for you, are there other nurses and doctors that you know of that have the same, I suppose first question is, are there many nurses and doctors who have the same beliefs as you? And secondly, if they do, then why are they not speaking out? Because I understand that they could risk losing their job, I understand this, but they did swear oaths when they became these professions. So why are they not speaking out, the ones that do agree with you?
Yeah, it's the same as with the general population. I think most people are not on board, and perhaps a lot of people are turning a blind eye. And it is a really good question. Why aren't more people standing up? Because this is an atrocious medical scandal, and I think once it does finally start to turn around in Canada, and once more people are comfortable standing up, I think a lot of people are going to have to live with shame and regret that they didn't stand up and say anything. And I think that's the simplest answer is that it's cowardly not to. And when, like you said, when you've taken an oath, I personally think there's some moral responsibility there to speak out against it. And unfortunately, most people are unwilling to potentially risk their own well-being, financial, professional, reputational, otherwise, even when they know that something this horrible and evil is going on. It's depressing, I think.
I genuinely think these people will sooner or later get exposed in the coming years. I think when people really realize the level of craziness that this was, and they'll look back, and I think a lot of people will question a lot of those people who partaked and who supported and allowed this to happen. It's a bit similar in the UK where we had a few during the lockdowns and COVID. There's quite a lot of, if you like, misinformation, lies that was spread, and I think in the UK there's still that kind of sentiment of, oh, you lied about that. There's still a bit of trust issues, if you like, with people in the UK government, and I feel like with this, it'll be a similar situation. I mean, with your current appeal, what's going on? Do you have medical professions supporting you? Are there people out there medically in the medical professions supporting your case?
Yeah, there is a lot of support. Like I said, I've had a lot of people even just email out of the blue and say, hey, I really support you. And but again, it's difficult to know that there's so much support, and there isn't a critical mass of people willing to actually just come out and publicly say that. And I was going to say there's currently a contract negotiation going on for nurses, but in the last round of contract negotiations, something that our unions won for nurses was, I believe it's 10 weeks of paid leave for gender affirming care. And so this is in a profession that is female dominated, just about 80% female. And we know we have what's called the nurses study, and it's collecting data from women, mostly women, and nurses who have done shift work for decades. And so we know from this ongoing um, study that nurses that are doing night shifts, and especially switching between days and night shifts, a lot of them end up with breast cancer. It's really unhealthy work to
Wow.
be doing. And so, when I saw it, this is clearly a problem of the profession. It's something that happens to female nurses. And then you go and do a contract negotiation, and it's not for more cancer care coverage for women who are directly impacted by the work that they're doing. Instead, it's for, males to go and get more time off after they get an elective breast implant because they want to be a woman. And it's just so, so, so infuriating. It blows my mind. And that's another thing where I think if you're not willing to even stand up and say this is a medical scandal, and you're also not willing to even suggest that, how wrong is that to have your own union, and so they're supposed to be negotiating for you, and they just clearly are only catering to this tiny minority that they want to virtue signal about. And so right now this happened with the BCGEU, which is another union in the province. And they're also, I just found out, they've, in this recent round of contract negotiations with their employees, secured $15,000 for gender affirming care. And again, this is like in the context of there's very little funds publicly. People are fighting for just basic cost of living increases, and yet you have these unions that are captured by woke ideologues, and instead the only sort of the successes they're managing to get is just giving gender affirming care to trans people, and that seems to be everyone's top priority.
So just to get this right, with the nurses' contract, you're saying so the nurses now, as part of their contracts, if they decide to change gender man to woman, woman to man, they can get extra 10 weeks off paid
paid
or 10
paid
leave.
sick leave.
Wow, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, what like you mentioned about breast cancer, and there's definitely there's a much bigger issue in terms of people getting breast cancer than there are people transitioning. It just makes no sense. Why? I suppose why again are not nurses speaking out against this, or even the ones that don't necessarily share or are afraid to go on record and say their views? Would there not be nurses essentially saying we don't actually need this? There's clearly an issue with breast cancer and other issues, and could we not? Would they, or is it just out of fear that if they do speak out against it, then they're worried that they could get labeled similar to yourself or similar to somebody like me, put into that category, so they don't want to speak about it?
Yeah, I do think it all just again comes down to the fear of speaking out, and it's just so endlessly frustrating. It's and this whole process, this 5 years of being persecuted for standing up for women's sex-based rights, and knowing that the people that complained about me, largely women, the organization that's persecuting me, it's mostly women, the panel that found me guilty, it was all women. And it's it's really, really disheartening to know that we would go against our own interests in this way, and then attack the women who are actually trying to stand up for women's sex-based rights.
I think that this conversation will blow a lot of people's minds in terms of what's going on in Canada. I don't think, well, we don't in UK, wherever we don't get information on Canada and what's going on. So I think it will really, really surprise a lot of people that this is still going on. And I think in UK, and it's obviously not over, this gender debate, and there is massive, massive, massive pushback. I think it's worrying when it's happening to healthcare professionals. I mean, 5 years is such a long period. And just to be clear, it was on the basis of your tweets. That was the reason for all of this to happen.
Yeah, so in the investigation, they came up with more than, it was almost 350 pages of content. So a lot of it was tweets, some of it was podcasts, and also articles that I've written on the topic. And what was interesting is that what it all came down to, out of these hundreds and hundreds of pages of speech that they said was horrible and transphobic and hateful, there were only 4 items that were actually used in the guilty verdict. And the reason that they use those 4 items is because they had to essentially make an argument that I had, um, because it was all in my off duty time. So they had to try to connect nursing to all of this. And so a couple of articles that I wrote had a little writer's bio at the end that just mentioned, oh, Amy lives in BC and she's a nurse, yada, yada. So then they're like, oh, look, you said you're a nurse at the end of this article. But nothing I ever said was, I think this because I'm a nurse, or because I'm a nurse, I'm saying this, or I'm a nurse and listen to me while I talk. I've never done that. So the vast majority, and none of the things that I was found guilty for were my tweets either. They had to
Oh,
exclude all of those, which was funny. But it also didn't stop the panel in their ruling. So knowing none of my tweets were used for finding me guilty, they still wrote pages and pages where they would take my tweets and then write several paragraphs about how wrong it was, how transphobic all my comments were. So it
that's
was really
influencing.
just,
That's influencing the judge and the jury and everything, right? If you're putting in that information in there, that's clearly done to influence. It's got no bearing on the case, but surely that's just there to influence a guilty
yeah,
verdict.
just there to, here's not, this has nothing to do with you being found guilty, but we didn't like that you said it and it was mean. And the other thing in the ruling is, at one point in the guilty verdict, it's just so ridiculous. It said, maybe if you had found a sort of polite and respectful way to advocate for your views, that would have been okay. And then a couple of pages later, it said that the very act of advocating for sex segregated spaces, meaning that a trans identified male or a trans woman, a biological male, is excluded from that, they said that in and of itself is discriminatory and wrong. So, on the one hand, they said you should have just been nice when you said whatever you said. And then on the other hand, they said no, and you can't exclude trans women from female spaces. We've determined that that's discrimination and it's impossible for you to do that. So it's a foregone conclusion that I would lose the case because they refuse to accept that trans women are males. And they've told me that if I say trans women are males, that I'm discriminatory, I'm derogatory, I'm guilty. So it was stacked against me the whole time, and in my opinion, the entire ruling, which is just pages and pages of just spouting woke nonsense and calling me a bigot. It was just an exercise in virtue signaling for these people.
Definitely. And what a waste of time and resources to spend this on yourself. They could be doing so much more important things, and they're wasting so much time and energy on you right now, and it's just absolutely bizarre. I mean, like, so uh, you're doing the appeal, and hopefully that goes well. And I mean, can you practice as a nurse now, or if you win the appeal, can you then practice as a nurse?
So I still hold my license and I can practice. So the thing about it is I was fired from Vancouver Coastal Health Authority. It's an enormous health authority. It's the second largest one in the province, and I can never work for any of their locations again. I mean, my union we're grieving the fact that I was fired, but in terms of success, I highly doubt it. And I've been blacklisted from a huge swath. It's sort of like the NHS, but it's broken down into smaller
Got
bits.
it.
And then there are other public health authorities, but there's no way, being blacklisted from one, that I would be hired at another. So I'm left with, if I want to work in nursing, finding a private clinic, opportunities outside of these public health authorities, which are all governed by woke ideology. And I do, I I'm not working as a nurse right now, but I do have a physician that I might start working with in the coming months. So it's it's something that I'm struggling with. Is This was a profession at one point that I was really proud to be in, And I was really proud of, at the end of my career before I got fired, I was working in leadership. I had been in a nurse educator. And at one point it was just, I really cared about, I really loved what I did. And then over the, last several years of going through this persecution and having the employer bring me in and out of HR, they really sort of sucked the joy out of this job that I once cared about. And I'm still struggling with, like, it's not right to have my profession taken away from me. And I don't know how I see myself staying in that in the future. So I'm just trying to figure that out. But it's really unfortunate to, to take people like myself, and I'm not the only one it's happened to, but to make examples out of people who care about truth and they care about science and who genuinely, loved what they did and were proud of their profession, and to just like hammer them and destroy them. I think it's really, really insane and wrong.
Definitely. And I think the thing is, like, from listening to your case and reading about it before this podcast, I think I've no doubt you will win. It's just a matter of when. This whole thing, you will win. Like, it's a fact. It's just, is it going to be in a year's time, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? You will win. I think people will see how absurd this is. It's just a matter of when. And I think that's the case for a lot of people who've had to suffer the way you have. It's just shameful and horrific that they're doing this. I mean, it's a tough question, but at any point did you, I suppose, regret anything? Did you at some points? I mean, it would be only human to think, oh, if only I didn't do that. I'm sure. Were there periods where you thought that?
To be honest, that's not something that I've ever felt in terms of speaking
I
up.
think.
I've been really angry about what's happened. I've been angry at specific people and just angry at the situation in general. But in all honesty, I've never ever felt regret for anything that I've said or done, because I know that none of it was wrong. Why why should I regret standing up for truth, reality, free speech, women's rights, child safeguarding? And I would 100% do the same thing over again, without a doubt. Without a doubt. So, um, if that's, if that's the one, if they were hoping that they could make me feel regretful about this, they certainly haven't done that.
Do you think if the case happened today, like they took you to court today, do you think it'd be the same outcome? Like, with the gang, everything that's happened in the last few years, it's just now they've called you up on a few tweets, called you up on podcasts, whatever. Do you think you'd have the same outcome that you've had?
Probably, I mean, it is Canada, so maybe, but also probably not. And it was interesting because as this was dragging out, and it was so frustrating how long it was taking, and I'm having discussions with my lawyer about, what was going on in the gender critical space. And so one of the things was the cast review. It came out too late to make it into evidence for my hearing, but that, like, going through everything, it was, every month it's like, oh, this happened and this is great, here it's now it's falling apart. And so much, even after the we had to the case was closed and we were waiting on a verdict, so much more has happened in such a short amount of time. I think it would be vastly, vastly different, because when this started, it was a lot earlier in sort of the public conversation. A lot of the public was a lot less aware of what was going on. And I think even the panel, a lot of this was news to them, and they had to sift through. We had so many expert witnesses, and they had to sift through so much information and basically get an entire education on trans activism and gender ideology, and as it was happening in real time. And I think it would be a lot more beneficial for me if it were happening right now, but it is what it is. And when you're saying, I think that I'll win eventually, I think so too. I do. And I'm not sure that, like, quote unquote justice will ever be served, but I look forward to one day just getting vindication for all of this absolute nonsense. And not, and part of the vindication for me is, like I said earlier, I hate the worst feeling that I sit with right now is I absolutely hate the thought that what happened to me could be used by other people to say, you should shut up, you shouldn't do anything. I don't want that. I'd rather be inspiring so that other people stand up. And so that, that's why I'm still I'll fight to the bitter end so that I can't be used as an example in that way. I just won't accept that.
I honestly think if it had happened a few years later, I think you'd definitely win. And the reason I say this is because we've had a lot of people on this podcast who've gone through a very similar fate to you, which is I feel like from maybe 2016 to 2000, 2001, sorry, 2016 to 2020, 2021, I feel like that was a really crazy period. And I think a lot of people really did get cancelled and really did lose their jobs. And it was so, we mentioned off air, but Graham Linehan's a good example of that, where literally lost everything. And maybe if he did that now, I don't think it would be the same effect. And we were joking, he's recently got arrested, and he said it's the best thing that's happened to him, that him getting arrested, it caused such nationwide global attention, that it really helped him. And I feel like with your case, it's similar, and in the sense of, I think when people wake up to the madness that's happening in Canada and just in general, I think sooner or later it's obviously very frustrating for yourself. But I with the way the world's going and just knowing what is right and what's wrong, it just makes sense that you will win. It's just hopefully it happens at a time when it really sparks a massive change, maybe in Canadian policy in terms of what goes forward. And maybe that's what they're also scared about, is if you do win, what are the implications on the wider Canada, because this has become global. I know about it, lots of other people know about it. So what's the implications if you do win
Yeah.
on them?
There's an irony, in the fact that the dragging it out, the process is the punishment, and the irony is that it's they're losing in a very public way over time. So it's a double-edged sword for them to try to draw out my punishment. It will come back to bite them, and it already has.
Definitely. It's been amazing speaking to you, Amy. I have a closing tradition on the show where I ask the guests for an unpopular opinion that they have that they think should be popular. So it can be anything mentioned on the show, it can be something completely random. But yeah, an unpopular opinion you have that you think should be popular.
Sure. I mean, you know what? This is one that I have said several times on X, and it always makes people really, really, really angry, or at least a certain subset of people. But this has to do, it's related to women's rights, and it's related to this slogan that's often used by trans activists where they say sex work is work. And so, and I talk about women's rights, and sometimes I talk about prostitution. So my really unpopular opinion that I think should be popular is that the males who pay for sex are either outright okay with rape, or at least philosophically, because they don't know that if they're paying for sex, if the person is consenting. So that's my super unpopular opinion. It's morally wrong. It could be rape, and if you purchase sex, then you have to admit that that could be rape.
Interesting. Okay, that'll be a good one. Be interesting to see comments on that one. But yeah, it's been amazing speaking to you, Amy. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.